Meeting today with Pauline Boss. Pauline is an emeritus professor of family social science at the University of Minnesota and stays very active. I and we at the University of Minnesota are very blessed to get to have her come and speak to us on occasion, and she's been so generous and gracious to be here with me today and to allow me some time to interview her about her work with Ambiguous Loss. Pauline, your work with Ambiguous Loss largely influenced by your clinical experiences, is that right?
It was. I was a graduate student in Madison at the University of Wisconsin, sitting in on Carl Whitaker's psychiatric residence groups. It was 1973, and there were no women in psychiatry at that time, and so I was essentially a token woman, along with another woman from another social work, I believe. And we got to sit there with Carl Whitaker and Gus Napier and other notables at the time to learn how to do family therapy. And it was at that time when I noticed that when intact families came in, fathers, mothers, and the children, that the fathers were often psychologically absent. It was the 70s, and at that time fathers felt that children were mother's work, and they asked why they needed to be there. So I came up with the idea of psychological father absence in intact families, and that was my first NCFR paper that I presented. I believe it was in Toronto. And then I was also studying theory development at the same time over in sociology. And the professor there said, "Pauline, it's about more than fathers. And you need to raise your theoretical idea to a more abstract level." And that's when I came up with the term ambiguous loss. And it hasn't let me go since. It's been a wonderful conceptual track to work on, and it gives me great pleasure to see that around the world and within the United States people are using it to test various populations that I hadn't even thought of.
Yeah, and prior to the interview, Pauline handed me a sheet of paper, 3 or 4 pages, of kind of a current review of who's doing research in ambiguous loss.
Yes.
It's an impressive list.
My assistant printed this off this morning. The topics are military deployment, divorce, immigration, dementia, serious mental illness, adoption, foster care, autism, no body to bury, the LGBT coming out process, and so on. Many of these are repeats. Brain injury also, and autism. What's interesting, though, is that it's coming from Australia, Pretoria, Georgia, in Russia, Istanbul, Turkey, London, Rome. The International Red Cross and Red Crescent in Geneva is using it. Brazil, Portugal, South Korea, Australia, and from many different universities within the United States.
It's incredible.
I'm in awe myself. It's
when you came, you said,
surprise.
I thought there'd be a list of 10 or 12.
That's what I thought.
And so, I mean, this list, there's 30 plus that are going on right now. These are ongoing. These aren't things that have been published in the past.
Many are dissertations.
Yeah.
And some, a smaller number, are professors who are doing these on grants.
So as you started with psychological father absence, and then it moved to ambiguous loss, how did your clinical work, how did that become impacted by what you were thinking theoretically? Because theory is really what drives our clinical work, and it should be what drives our research work.
I guess you'd call me an inductive researcher, because I get my hypotheses from my clinical work.
Okay.
It is in sitting with families clinically where I get an idea that needs to be tested. So it's more grounded theory development, it's more inductive work where I come up with the theory out of observation, then I go and test it more deductively.
Have you found that for ambiguous loss in particular that there is a methodology or a tradition that seems to fit well for investigating those concepts?
If you're studying ambiguous loss, the concept of someone being either missing psychologically or physically. Psychologically would be like autism, brain injury, dementia, addiction, or physically, if there's no body to be found, someone lost at sea, 9/11,
yeah.
and so on, Katrina, where they're washed away.
Right.
If you're studying ambiguous loss, the situation of ambiguous loss, I think social construction theory works better. And therefore, I would follow that by saying qualitative research methodologies work better for that kind of investigation. If, in fact, you want to quantify, most people have been studying the outcome of ambiguous loss, which is boundary ambiguity. That is, you don't know if that person is in or out of your family. You don't know if they're alive or dead. You don't know if they're coming back or not. And there we do have measurement instruments for that, which are being translated as we speak into German, but have also been translated into Chinese and some other languages. Then that theoretical base becomes what I call, and what others have called, Scanzoni, for example, neo-structure functionalism. It's about roles, it's about boundaries, and every time you start talking about roles and boundaries regarding families, it puts you into that structural category. But I like the term that was attributed to me as being a neo-structure functionalist, which means that I don't attribute those roles and tasks based on gender. That yes, a family does have roles, someone has to perform them. If someone has dementia, someone else has to perform them, but if the family doesn't change, those roles get left undone. And the boundaries of that family are unclear. And from that perspective, of neo-structure functionalism, the system does not work well without boundary maintenance. More postmodern-wise, boundaries are not so relevant anymore to family studies. That is, many people feel the village is the boundary of the family, or the tribe is the boundary of the family. We learned that after the tsunami in South Asia. The community is the family. And so then I would move to social construction work with families where boundaries are not that important to them.
So certainly being open to more culturally specific definitions of family and family grouping is
absolutely. I think we have to do that. We must do that in the 21st century, because families are not defined the same by all people anymore. As I got older in this work, I listened more. And I find that a lot of the things I learned in graduate school I need to set aside or adjust right now, because what I think is family, I grew up in a southern Wisconsin farm family, Protestant, Euro-American, is not the experience of a lot of people. And so I need to listen to hear what their experience is and how they define family.
Now, and that statement, so I'm thinking of a woman and a professional who's had a very long career. Could you see yourself making that statement, 30 years ago or so when you were in grad school, like, my definition of family may not fit for everybody else? I mean,
I did say that, and the paper
you did?
never got published. Yeah, I think I was a bit of a renegade back then, perhaps because I grew up in an immigrant family. With, I say we always had 12 or 13 people around the table. A juvenile delinquent from town sent to my father. He was good with kids like that.
You weren't the juvenile delinquent.
No, I wasn't.
No, you waited until much later in your life.
We were 4 kids, but we had all these other people. My uncle who came to live with us, my grandmother who came to live with us, a hired girl and a hired man in those days. We had those kinds of people. I'm sorry about the term, but that's what they were then.